let's let's start. It's my pleasure to introduce Steve Delamarter, who is a major pillar in the study of Ethiopia from North America. He's in Portland, Oregon. It's early in the morning for him. His PhD is from Claremont Graduate School, where he worked with James Sanders in an emphasis on the Old Testament and early Judaism. He served as the chair of the Society of Biblical Literature section on the textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible and was founding chair of the section on Ethiopic Bible and Literature. For several years, he served on the board of the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning in Theology and Religion and made frequent consulting in the area of online pedagogy. Since 2005, he has directed the Ethiopic Manuscript Imaging Project, EMIP, which has digitized, get this, over 12,000 manuscripts in North America, Ethiopia, Kenya, South Africa, England, and Ireland. Steve, I hand it over to you, and we're looking forward to your discussion.
Very good. Very good. Well, let me give it just a minute here to turn some things on, share a screen, and then we'll begin talking. Are you able, is everyone able to see the
Yes.
PowerPoint slide?
Yeah, we got it.
Very good. And yeah, here's our outline for today. I need, first of all, to explain that Daniel Assefa and Ralph Lee, two of our great colleagues, are outside their countries, each and traveling and involved in responsibilities that take them away, not able to be with us today. But they're here in spirit, and so we're looking forward to this. Let me, yeah, I think we're ready then to jump right into things. First of all, let me say we are happy to welcome you to this launch of the THEOT Project website. We're honored you are here. We have worked together, this team of people, along with Curt Niccum, has worked together for 12 years. We are not necessarily smart, but we are very tenacious. And we have been at this thing for quite a while, and we're really glad to come to this moment. Many times, and we've learned from one another through this process, but also say we've learned from the manuscripts, if that's possible. Many times we've been amazed and inspired by the people behind those manuscripts. They were devoted to their God. They were committed to their work. We clearly see the signs of their intelligence, the accuracy of their work, their creativity, and we're humbled by all of it. We've been made better by the work we've had before us to do. So we're going to start today, and Garry, I'll turn things over to you for just a moment. Yeah.
Yes, welcome everyone. It's great to have you here. This presentation is the second presentation of our discoveries. Last week we had a session in Amharic led by Daniel Assefa and hosted by Dr. Mirsha Alahain at Addis Ababa University to honor the tradition that produced the materials that we study.
Oh.
We have been grateful, yes, we've been deeply grateful to our friend Curt Niccum for the role he has played with us for so many of these years. Unfortunately, he had to leave the project just over a year ago for medical reasons, but his presence among us still affects what we are doing.
Yeah, give me just a second here. Well, I can locate where we got an open mic someplace. And
I think it may be Kaliab.
Oh, Kalaab. Hold on just one second. Let me do like that. Yeah, good. Okay. So as we begin here, three things we want you to know about THEOT. The first is the answer to the question, why are you doing this? And the short answer is, we think that the Ethiopic biblical tradition is important, but it's neglected, and it's rarely been studied for its own sake, to tell its own story. In the last 35 years, virtually all of the books of the Ethiopic New Testament have been published in a critical edition. In the same time period, though, we have only a few works on the Old Testament, like Fuchs on Micah and Hosea, Nib on Ezekiel, Jeremy Brown on Jonah, Amari Mesfin on chapter 11 of the Daniel cycle. In earlier times, those who have studied the Ethiopic often did so for the sake did not do so for the sake of the Ethiopic tradition. So we think of the Septuagintists from a century ago up through mid-century have used the Ethiopian manuscripts to help describe the early development of the Greek tradition from 1,000 years earlier. It's amazing work that they've done, and we commend it and glad that they included some attention to the Ethiopian tradition. But they read the manuscripts, but they're actually listening for ghosts, echoes of the ancient ancestor text behind the Ethiopic text. In our day, people have begun to realize just how large the gap is between the origins of the Ethiopic tradition and the extant manuscripts. There are just too many methodological questions to be able to use it without a lot of caveats for the textual criticism of the Greek Bible. As a daughter of the Septuagint, the Ethiopic was never considered helpful for the textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible. So if you can't use it to improve the text of the Greek Bible or of the Hebrew Bible, then why would a person study the Ethiopic, to put it kind of sharply here? Manuscript traditions offer us at least two things for our consideration. We can either study the origins of the tradition, or we can study the later text forms that emerge over time. One of the big conclusions we've reached is you can't use the methods and assumptions and vocabulary of the study of origins to describe the phenomena of the emerging text. It's just not built for that. And in the opinion of a person who only wants to know the original text form of the tradition, every change away from the original is a corruption. We've all heard people describe the variants in extant manuscripts as ongoing corruptions of the original Greek. Believe us, no Ethiopian scribe ever got up in the morning and said to his wife, "Hey, honey, I'm going out to corrupt the biblical text today." Now, that's absurd, of course, and we laugh at it, but our language involves us in statements that make it sound like that's the case. We have no question about the legitimacy of the study of the origins of the Ethiopic tradition. In fact, on our website, you're going to find nearly everything you need to construct critical editions of the earliest attainable texts of the 27 or so books that we have studied and created data sets for. But this has not been the goal of our work. We want to understand the Ethiopic for the sake of the Ethiopic, the extant Ethiopic manuscripts for their own sake. And we have become convinced that, as I've said, it just doesn't work to use the methodology and language forged to study the origins of the tradition to describe the dynamics at work in the emerging and evolving of the tradition. And that's what we're really focused on, the emerging and the evolving tradition. New language, new methods have to be forged, and we have tried to understand two things about the textual history of the Ethiopic Old Testament. Number one, what text forms existed in the manuscripts from the 14th to the 20th century? And number two, what mechanisms were at work that made their text forms remain constant on the one hand and yet also evolve over the last 7 centuries?
The second thing you need to know about the THEOT Project is that our work is grounded on the foundations of statistical analysis. We want to know about the textual history of the Ethiopic Old Testament. And in the language of statistics, all the manuscripts that carry the Ethiopic Old Testament represent the population we want to study. But according to the logic of the statistical approach, it is not necessary to look at every manuscript to know a lot about the textual history. Instead, we prepare either random samples or representative samples. And a truly proper random sample, I think, is impossible because so many of the manuscripts are lost. A truly random samples, you'd have all the manuscripts ever created, and then you would randomly choose among them. Instead, we have selected what we believe to be a representative sample. So if the sample is large enough and indeed representative of the population, then we can draw conclusions about the population. And if we do it correctly, we can be quite confident in the accuracy of our claims. We do use sociological models to interpret bell-shaped curved, so that we can understand the statistical logic of a bell-shaped curve and how they describe the behavior of groups of scribes in the Ethiopian book culture. The more data we have, the more clearly we can know the patterns that have been durable in the tradition over time. The THEOT Project reached a milestone this past year when we surpassed 1.5 million data points from the text in the manuscripts. Of course, it required the help of computers for such a large data set. And so we use computers to generate the data. And if we're going to analyze these data points, it's going to require a lot of statistical analysis, data science, and data visualization, all with the help of computers. We have given ourselves to each of these areas of study. I'll mention that there are videos on the website that introduce all of these concepts and illustrate how we put them to work for us. And we will speak more about these later.
Let me just say at this point, there are over 30 hours of these videos on the website, and we want to give a shout out here to Kalav Demeka for his work on editing all these videos, for creating the opening and closing bits and the music of the videos. Thank you, Kalav. The third thing we want you to know about THEOT is that all of our work is open access. We have often described our work as a mapping project. Our job has been to prepare maps of this unknown territory of Old Testament textual history. We now have a lot of data about the books of the Ethiopic Old Testament. We have maps. We want you to use them. So we're making many, many things available on the website. Among these are hundreds of transcriptions of manuscripts. Every one of those is interesting in its own right, but you're going to learn the most about the manuscripts when you know them in their context, when you consult the map. When you use the dendrograms and the statistical reports, they will show you where each of these manuscripts fits into the emerging Ethiopic tradition. In terms of what the coherence-based genealogical method calls the pre-genealogical profile, the THEOT data will provide the most extensive such reports ever generated for Ethiopian manuscripts. So let's begin our tour of the website here. I'll pull it over in front. Are you all able to see the website that I've just pulled over in front of the PowerPoint? Yep, good. Thank you for your head nods. Garry, to you.
Yeah, the URL of the THEOT website is theotproject.com. As we guide you through the website, we will work our way across the navigation tabs at the top of the home page. And actually, these tabs are across the top of every other page in the website as well. First, we have the About tab. Under the About tab, you'll find the usual sorts of information. The Personnel page gives a picture and description of the people who have worked on the project over the past 4 years. The History tab gives the roots and background of the project, describing the developments that led to the start of the project in 2012 and how the project has unfolded since then. Finally, under the Publications tab, we have a list of the publications written by members of the team. Next, we have the tab on Reports. The Reports tab is where you find much of the data we have produced in the project. This is where you can learn about the discoveries we have made for more than 25 biblical books of the Ethiopic Old Testament. And the reports are divided into 2 sections. We have Type 1 reports, we have Type 2 reports. The basic difference between the Type 1 and Type 2 reports is the depth to which we analyze the statistical and philological data we have produced in our workflows. Let's take a look at a typical Type 1 report. Each of these reports offers 8 key artifacts generated in our workflow, along with a video to explain each one of them. Because of the limits of time, we will talk about a few of them, and you will have to explore the rest for yourselves. The videos should explain most questions. So the 8 artifacts, first of all, the aligned texts. This is a PDF showing every word of every manuscript in the sample, and we have aligned them by hand by shared roots, shared is roots. And aligning by hand, what I mean is put them in a Microsoft Word doc, tab, 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 space, space. Align things up is what the aligned texts are. Now, when these aligned texts are converted into numbers, we can eventually produce the dendrogram. This is a JPG image file depicting the proximity of manuscripts to one another in visual form. And by the way, I'll mention it is not a stemma. Okay, a dendrogram merely shows how closely related the texts are of various manuscripts. What you see here, so the dendrogram is overlaid then with colored boxes and other overlays to represent our working hypotheses about clusters. And each dendrogram has stars that indicate the best representative manuscript of each cluster and a legend box with key information about the sample of data. Next, the THEOT text viewer. We believe this is the single most effective tool for the study of textual history, and we will explain more about it later in this presentation. Our most important discoveries came from the final two artifacts provided on the Type 1 report pages. You'll want to watch the videos to see what we discovered and how we discovered it. Moving on now to the Type 2 reports, these provide all the data necessary to achieve the goals of a Type 1 report. But the final analyses required to make a Type 1 report, the last two spreadsheets, take a great deal of time. And so we had to make the judgment that these were beyond the scope of THEOT as a mapping project. And by mapping project, we mean mapping out the terrain. So for one thing, other scholars can pick things up and run with it. But we have completed 7 of these studies and are convinced that they contain the primary data related to the unfolding of the textual history between the 14th and 20th centuries. We invite you to enter into the work of discovering and describing the character of these mechanisms in the other books of the Old Testament. We have provided all the data and tools necessary to do so for more than 25 Old Testament books. And be sure to look at the data at the bottom of all the report pages. This is where we give you the details about the samples of text and manuscript we used in this study and about the discoveries we made regarding clusters and their best representative manuscripts and about any new minority recensions we discovered.
I'll just jump in and add to that statement. Just about every line of this, or at least start after we give the sample information, every line of this is a major finding worth an article. The fact that Davies Deborah Bazan manuscript is the best representative of the EA1, earliest attested 1 text form. The fact that GG88 is the best representative of the EA2 text form, and then that the fact that there are minor recensions, there is a minor recension, previously unknown or unidentified, in these 2 manuscripts, and so this information is just really important for each of the reports. Back to you, Garry.
Next, we move to the Tools tab. It has been as satisfying for us to develop new tools and methods as it has been to make the discoveries we have about Ethiopia's textual history. But once again, we do not have the time to explore all of these thoroughly. But we will look at the text viewer, and we think that the most useful tool we have created is this THEOT text viewer. It gives us the ability to see the phenomena of the textual tradition in a single view. Let's take a minute now to look at the text viewer. First of all, in the drop-down menu at the top, you can survey the books of the Bible for which we have completed our work. 3 of the 8 books of the Orient, Esther and Job, Psalms, Psalm 151, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel from the prophets, and 11 of the 12 minor prophets, along with a few other works. On the front page of a book in the text viewer, we have put the text of the manuscript that is the best witness to the earliest cluster in our sample. But notice on the left, there are links corresponding, links of the verse references, and you can click on one of those links, and the text viewer will display every word of every one of the 30 to 40 manuscripts in the study. They are all aligned by columns, and even better, because we did the statistical studies and produced the dendrograms, we can arrange the manuscripts into their clusters. Now, you can see all the uniformity and variation of the tradition in one view.
Let me just, this one example we have up is from Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 15c, and it is a perfect diagnostic for whether you're looking at the earliest attested form of the text, which we have, shows very, very clearly there's a demarcation. Just visually, you can see the digital footprint of a block of things going on up here, and then a block of things going down there. Not surprisingly, this is the 14th to the 16th century. This is the 17th to the 20th century manuscripts. And you say, what about these other things? Well, these are actually late copies of earliest attested texts, which are being influenced by late readings. But if you see their dates, you see that's what they are. Yeah, again, I can't stress enough that this tool that Garry designed and built, we poured all of our data into it to be able to give this wonderful visual interface, to be able to see the tradition at work. This is 700 years, 34 scribes working across 700 years to give us this picture. And because we've processed the data, we know what cluster they're part of and where they fit together. Back to you, Garry.
Okay. And be sure to look at the data set prepared for the book of Jonah by Jeremy Brown, who happens to be in the meeting here today. Instead of the normal 30 to 40 manuscripts, there are 105 manuscripts in that data set. The data points in that set alone come to 125,000.
Yeah, so just got to, again, put your eyes on this thing. It's really quite remarkable. And if for those that are from the statistical standpoint, you say, what size N, what number of manuscripts do you need to be able to get a clear picture of the textual history? Well, to know the answer precise to that, you'd have to run a number of experiments. To this point, the most manuscripts that have been used for critical editions and so on, I believe NIB uses 18, something like that. Not many more than that. So all of our things are based on 30 to 40, and you get a real clear picture. But if you say, what if you ran that up, to 5 times that, you'd get what Jeremy did here, this amazing array of all the manuscripts sitting right there in front of you, and you can walk through and see the degree to which the textual history remains constant from samples that only have 30 to 40 in them compared to this one that has 105. So it's just really a marvelous piece of work. We commend you, Jeremy. Any project that in the digital humanities that creates a lot of data must commit itself to the emerging fields of data science and data visualization. On their own, the 1.5 million data points we've created are incomprehensible to the human brain without various levels of statistical analyses and a knowledge of data visualization. So we've developed our project database, accessible here, and data visualization tools side by side. So the project database is a Google sheet that has a whole bunch of tabs on it that give information on holding institutions and manuscript information. The holding institutions have geographic information from which when you put this information into data visualization tools. Well, let's show you 2 of them. Let's look first of all, going back here to tools and then to data visualization. Most of the visualizations you'll see on this page are amateurish to this point, made mostly by me. The first of these, though, is really a fine piece of work by our consultant and chief statistician on these things, Jared Jacobs. He used the platform of a Power BI Microsoft tool here and then just grab the data out of the spreadsheet to put together this visualization, which has here's the overview, 95 holding institutions. By the way, this data is stale. It's at least 4 months old. So there are many more holding institutions, many more manuscripts. But on the map here, you can zoom in on the holding institutions from Ethiopia and explore their locations, a bit more information about them as you do the tip rollover thing. If you want to narrow, and you can see the chronological spread and distribution of the manuscripts that can be affected, changed by using this chronological slider. If you want to just look at one particular book, we punch into Ezekiel, we get the information now limited down just for the book of Ezekiel. And there are a host of queries that you can formulate and interact with this using this dashboard, they're called, to get information. It's really very amazing. So spend some time with that one. I'll illustrate one other thing. Suppose you want to answer the question, how many times do the scribes of the Ethiopian tradition make idiosyncratic errors? Say, how could you possibly know that? Well, it turns out because of the way that we proceeded creating our data, we have very precise numbers about that. That's what this visualization gives. It's what's called a box and whisper plot of acts of scribal idiosyncrasy, defined digitally as any column of words in which one and only one manuscript has a particular reading. Okay, that would be an act of scribal idiosyncrasy. And then if you gather together all the statistics for 600 copies, 22 books of the Ethiopic Old Testament, again, this data is old, and then you have to learn how to read a box and whisker plot. It essentially lays out the distribution of the manuscripts and the quartiles. That's the sort of box that's down, and then the whiskers that go out mark the median and the lower hinge and all this kind of stuff. It just takes 15 minutes to read up a little bit on box and whisper and understand. But then with the aid of these rollover tip information, you can see exactly which manuscripts are outside the norm. Anyway, just look at this now with that little introduction and answer that question. What percentage of acts of scribal activity are acts of scribal idiosyncrasy? Across 700 years, we got a pretty big data set here that says that number is somewhere between 0.2 and 1.3, or excuse me, 2.3% of the words. It speaks to a tremendous amount of uniformity with these acts of variation outside of that as the odd thing, not the normal thing. So again, it's just absolutely amazing. You can stare at the spreadsheet as long as you want, and you will not figure this out. Put it into a data visualization, and it becomes almost transparent in just a little bit. So the thing you should know about the relationship between, I'm going back here to tools, this tab and this tab, is that our database was built for data visualization tools. That's really important. If you build a database without this in mind, you have to go through an entire separate process to extract the data, arrange the data in ways that it can be ingested into either Tableau or Power BI. We have done that work for you. As a matter of fact, in the project database, this text on the right-hand side tells you what the data that's in the tab of the spreadsheet can be used for and how it can be used in the sense of a data visualization tool. So this again is a growing edge. If you're in the humanities, you've probably never confronted these things before, like me, and so it's quite a learning curve to have to sort these things out. But there's just a lot of stuff there. me see one more tab here, then I'll turn it back over to Garry. Data. So sorry. Got ahead of myself. Yeah, the THEOT computer programs. There's a tab here to get more information and about how they work, how they were built. There'll be some videos coming that will walk you through and explain all that. There are already a couple in another part of the site. So, Garry, let me turn it over to you for the methods tab.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Yeah, so the methods tab. The methods domain is home to half a dozen tabs. Each one will take you through another aspect of the THEOT project and explain the methods we developed to carry out our investigation. Again, we're only going to highlight a few of them. One tab is devoted to the THEOT workflow. Here we provide a host of brief videos that explain project assumptions and working hypotheses, as well as guided tours through just about every step of the workflow itself. Another tab will introduce you to the processes by which we discovered the central findings of the THEOT project about textual history. It is called Processing Data with Spreadsheet Filters. Here you will find 5 videos that walk through these processes step by step. If you want to really understand the central findings of the project, we recommend that you take a look at these videos.
Let me just jump in and add my affirmation of that point, that our best stuff comes from what we did with taking a set of data that we'd already processed a whole bunch of times and then running it through, applying a set of filters in normal spreadsheet function. Again, completely unknown territory for me. Ralph Lee, one of our members, his first PhD was in engineering. The man knows spreadsheets like you wouldn't believe. And we were able to harness that stuff. So if you really are interested in the method and how that relates then to our most important discoveries of the project, you'll want to look over these videos. Very good. Back to you, Garry.
Okay, now on to Transcribus. So Transcribus is an AI-based tool, artificial intelligence-based tool for automated transcription of manuscripts. We use this tool extensively and we're involved in the second-generation algorithm trained in Transcribus for Ethiopic script. Soon we will provide videos that explain how the algorithm was developed and how we forged its use into a workflow with a team of transcribers in Addis Ababa who were led by Daniel Assefa.
The final tab here has to do with our work on lists of Ethiopic manuscripts. This is, the manuscripts are the foundation of it all. Finding manuscripts is not easy. Anybody who enters into our field has to spend 10 years probably learning the layout of the land on where stuff is. So we've tried to help address that by providing this general list of Ethiopic manuscripts. So the sheet currently contains over 400 known manuscripts, not counting Psalters. But I have to let you know before you look at it, I almost don't want to put it out there because it's going to get criticized, and it should, because there's just all kinds of stuff that's not present in this thing. Nevertheless, we can tell you the names of 400 manuscripts with Ethiopic Old Testament books in them, and a whole bunch of them, you see the column J that has the link, so you go to the manuscript itself. And so the minute that Ted Urho produces one of these things, we'll abandon this and go use that. In the meantime, this is here, and it hopefully has some usefulness. Okay, Ethiopic manuscripts. So let me remove the website. That concludes our website part of the thing. We want to, we'll say, to understand the findings of the project, it's necessary to understand the methods we've employed to discover the findings. And we have here just a few key steps that we've developed in our digital methods. The website will tell you about several others. One of the first things we'll say is making transcriptions using AI tools guided by human intelligence is a sort of fundamental starting point. For a project like this, you cannot stress too much the importance of accurate transcriptions of the manuscripts in our studies. All of the transcriptions went through at least 3 reviews in order to, and one of them double blind, in order to make them as accurate as possible. For the last few years, we've been using Transcribus to create first drafts of the transcription of a manuscript. Ralph Lee was the one who led the algorithm training process in the second iteration. The first one was handled by the folks in Hamburg, who are still sort of in charge of that algorithm, the GAES algorithm. But Ralph Lee on our team was the one who led the algorithm training process for the second iteration. And depending on the condition of the manuscript and the clarity of the images, the accuracy rate for Transcribus is getting better and better into the high 90th percentile of accuracy, 96, 97, 98% accuracy for doing its work. But the transcriptions produced by Transcribus only become the electronic base text for the members of the AUDIS transcription team, led by Daniel Assefa and half a dozen fine workers. The transcriptions, like say, go through 3 additional reviews before they were accepted into the project as complete. Special mention goes to Hewot Samuel, the woman here, who has played a key role in the finishing part of this process, working closely with Daniel Assefa. Special mention also goes to Ato Demeka Berhane, who has worked directly with myself to produce transcriptions of manuscripts bearing previously unknown minor recensions of Old Testament books. So thanks very, very much to the team of people and what they discovered. Garry?
Yeah, so the next step is to create a digital grid by measuring the presence or absence of words in a column. The first thing you have to know is the means by which we turn words into numbers and what we mean by that statement. So there's a couple of decisions that went into this. First, how does a computer know which words in one manuscript to compare to which words in other manuscripts? So for our project, we specify this by aligning words in the same column. The words in the column, this tells the computer program which words to compare against each other. We did experiment with other options rather than just the same as root. Some of the other options were, you put singular nouns in one column and plural nouns in another column, or a third-person masculine singular object pronoun in one column and second-person feminine plural object in another. And of course, you can imagine many other grammatical features that this could be based on. But in the end, for our purposes, we decided to align in the same column words with that share the same as root. Now, the second issue is once you've aligned the words into columns based on shared as root, how does the computer decide whether a variant is the same as another variant? Here again, you could decide that a singular noun is one variant and a plural noun is a different variant, etc. But for our purposes, in the end, we settled on a simple algorithm. If the word is present in a column, it's one variant. And if there is not a word there, it's a different variant. And I'll add that more precise information about these decisions can be found on the THEOT website, in the videos on the reports pages, and in the methods section. All right, then next, a computer script analyzes the aligned text and assigns a 1 if there is no word present and a 2 if there is a word present. We reserve 0 to indicate that it cannot be determined whether a word is present or not. For example, if a page is missing or part of the page is torn away, you just don't know what the rating is. And so, again, we use a 0 to indicate that. And note that these numbers 1 and 2 are not the kind of numbers you would add together and get a sum or do some kind of other math. They simply represent whether a word is present or absent, and so in a sense are arbitrary symbols for the presence or absence of a word. Now, we do use these numbers to answer the question, how many times do two manuscripts have the same number in the same column? And this gives us a measure of how similar one manuscript is to another. And I'm certainly not an expert on coherence-based genealogical method, but I believe this is the pre-genealogical measure of the affinity. And, so have all these numbers, what else can we do? Well, in a sense, everything.
Yeah, so what now shows on your screen is a sort of a workflow. It takes 10 operations of transcription to produce texts and put them into, aggregate them and align them and all that kind of stuff. 10 different operations. And that produces then, I hope you can see this, it's kind of small. This is a miniature version of a layout of just one book's report, and it's wider than what it looks like. The point here is to show you that there are fully then 16 operations of processing the data after we produce that sort of the foundation of our statistical universe is this data tab, this sheet of all these ones and twos. But then by processing them in different ways, you can arrive at different tools actually that help you identify best representative manuscripts, or produce the dendrograms, or use the data for spreadsheets. So this is just really a magnificent overview of kind of the domain, and it all derives from that turning words into numbers and then processing the data in various kinds of ways.
Okay, then the next step is to aggregate the statistics across the entire sample of the text to quantify the statistical relationships of all the manuscripts to one another. And so what you see here is a table of percentages, and it's for each manuscript against each other manuscript, it gives a percentage of similarity. Okay, so, we could have over 1,000 data points, and so it counts those all up. How often is it the same compared to a total number of data points, and then creates this percentage. Part of the reason for generating percentages and the human eye, I mean, that's pretty tough going to wade through this table of percentages and try to make sense out of it. So the next step then is to turn it into a dendrogram, which we do by exporting these numbers into the R statistical package. Some of you might be familiar. I know a lot of universities use that, and so we took advantage of that. What R does is it takes all these percentages and produces a visualization that represents the statistics in a graphical form. So that's what you see in front of you here. So to interpret the dendrogram, so the tree-like, the black and white tree, you might call it, is made by the R statistical package. Again, this is not a stemma, okay? A stemma looks similar, but it's something different, okay? It doesn't claim the origin, one manuscript came from another. It's just a measure of how similar they are. And then the colored boxes and stars, these are our interpretation and represents our working hypotheses as we work on the data.
Yeah. Well, let's just say a few final words here about our findings, and then we'll move on to hearing from our respondents. The project findings have to do with focus in on some things. First of all, the mechanisms of uniformity and variation in the extant tradition. That's been one of the primary, if you get all the manuscripts that exist out there, what stories do they tell us about the uniformity and variation in the extant tradition? And because we have generated these 1.5 million data points about manuscripts across the thing, we can aggregate these things. And we believe we can describe the fundamental mechanisms that shape the textual history in the last 7 centuries. They are 5 in number. These are the 5 forces that account for all of the unity and variation in the tradition. what just came out of my mouth was a big claim. Okay, big claims require big evidence, and so I don't expect you to just take this at face value, but to look into it. Does it really come down to five mechanisms? The first two are really obvious. The first mechanism among scribes is a passion to preserve the traditional text that they have received. And we can quantify that by looking at the uniformity of the tradition, which sits right at 85% of the words in all the manuscripts, show up in all the columns. They are based on the same Ge'ez root. That is a remarkable indication of uniformity across the tradition. And we can not only say it's a uniform tradition, we can say it's uniform on average to 85% of all the words of all the manuscripts. The second mechanism is sort of the opposite of the first. It's the human frailty expressed in scribal idiosyncrasy. And we've shown you with that one visualization that we can quantify exactly the range of idiosyncrasy that takes place amongst the scribes. And now, and we can add another 0.2, 2.3 to this 85% and say, 85 to 87% includes these two mechanisms at work. The passion to get it just like the tradition has it, and then acts of scribal idiosyncrasy. That leaves about 14, 15% left. And it is these last three mechanisms that describe the mechanisms responsible for all the remaining variation. Not all the remaining, all that is, all the variation in the tradition is in this last 14, 15%. They are three things in number, and these are our big three findings. And so again, it's what those videos and that one set of videos will walk you through how it is that we discovered these, and can say that minority variance in the ETH1 period. Okay, there are variants that appear among the earliest manuscripts in EA1 and EA2, in EA3 and EA4, clusters in the dendrograms. And that's the third mechanism that makes up part of this 15%. The second of these final three is a move that the standardized editors had to make in regard to those minority variants. They had to make judgments about those minority variants from the ETH1 period. And in about 2/3 of the cases, they simply throw them out. They make a decision and they throw out all those minority variants that existed in the early period. On the other hand, with the final third or a quarter, they elevate a minority reading from the ETH1 period to become the main text in the ETH2 period from the 17th century to the 20th century. So those are huge decisions. They tell us everything about the standardized editors and their agenda beyond just preserving the traditional text. Finally, then the standardized editors to do one final thing. There are quite a bunch of places where they decide that no reading in the tradition thus far says the right thing, and they create new readings. And the final report that you'll find there is the lists of these new readings created in the 17th century. These three mechanisms right here are our description of the forces that govern the emerging of the tradition. So we really commend your attention to those things. Finally, then, the rest is details. It was our big claims then are these five mechanisms explain all of the variation in the tradition. Again, I'm very aware that that is a colossal claim. There's nothing else necessary. No other explanations are necessary to explain the primary characteristics of the tradition beyond those five mechanisms. You don't have to refer to a Syriac or a Syro-Arabic Vorlage or some other kind of a thing. It is those mechanisms. Now, that's not to say that it's possible that some of those elements were influenced by a reading of an Arabic biblical text, which certainly is a very plausible possibility. But we have not made such correlations yet, nor do we know of anyone else to date who has. But we would love to see this work go forward. The folks, Ronnie Volan and company that are working on the Arabic texts have just done huge things in the last 10, 15 years in an area, one of the few that's as neglected in the history of scholarship as is the Ethiopic. And they have generated so much stuff. I'll bet you there are things that we'll be able to find that correlate things going on in the Arabic tradition and in the Ethiopic tradition. Nevertheless, we still stand by the statement that you don't have to know what those are to understand the basic characteristics of the tradition in the last 7 centuries. The rest, as we say now here, is details. We can tell you the best manuscript to read for the earliest attested one. It would form, I think, the base text for most people's collations of manuscripts and so on, if they were going to create a critical edition to get started on things. 27 books we've identified what the EA1 best one. EA2, standardized. That's the first major new revised text form in the 17th century, and the modern Textus Receptus that comes out of that. Beyond that, we've identified more than 15 previously unidentified minor recensions, where a number of manuscripts attest to a form of the text that is very different from anything else in the tradition. And they weren't the mainstream ones. That's why we call them minor recensions. Well, that brings us to a close on this part of our, I'm going to stop sharing here and move my screen back over here. And it's our great privilege now to have some friends respond to what they've seen. We asked Wendy Belcher and Todd Hannaken and Stephen Kaplan to look over the website ahead of time and give us some idea of we really value the input we're getting from these respondents and will make them a central part of our agenda in the coming year to continue to improve the website. I think what I'd like to do, Wendy Belcher had some scheduling things. She may or may not be able to check in with us by the end of the meeting. Very sorry that didn't work out for her. But Stephen Kaplan, I wonder if we could ask you first to respond. I'm going to pin you to the thing that should make you at the center of things here and let you make your presentation.
Okay. Is everything working? Thank you.
Yep.
As you can tell from that initial question, I am a Luddite, and I will put this into a context which I often tell people. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on a machine which is called a typewriter. Some of the younger people may have to Google that to know what that is. And in the days when to view a manuscript, you had to physically go to the library where the manuscript was in order to look at it. So in the 40 plus years, this is remarkable for me to see what is happening. And as a result of this, in some ways, what I'm going to talk about briefly is what is almost prehistory in terms of what was being done about the Old Testament, the Bible, before a project like this. Again, as someone for whom the word that was used by Garry, the word simple algorithm is an oxymoron, I hope I can contribute a little bit here. Since the beginning of European scholarship about Ethiopia, and we must remember that scholarship tended to focus on Christianity and on Semitic languages, the Bible has had a central place in Ethiopian studies. August Dillman, who was one of the founders of Ethiopian Studies in Europe, focused a great deal of his attention on the Bible in the widest sense of the term. In addition to publishing editions of Enoch, Jubilees, and the Ascension of Isaiah, he tried to publish the complete Old Testament text, although he wasn't able to. Perhaps even more importantly, both his grammar and his lexicon of Gez relied largely on biblical material. Now, using biblical material, using more correctly, a translation text to do a grammar and a lexicon is quite common. In fact, on some level, it's almost inevitable. But it raises some interesting challenges as to the character of the Gez text that's used in original compositions that aren't translations. And we should be aware that if you're using Dillman's grammar or you're using his lexicon, that a great deal of it is shaped by the fact that he was relying primarily on biblical texts. Now, this translation issue, and Steve talked a bit about that, also grabs a place in Edward Uhlendorf's book, Ethiopia and the Bible. One of the topics he devotes a fair amount of attention to is the question of what original language or languages form the text for the translation of the Bible into Ethiopic. And while some Ethiopian traditions claim that the entire Old Testament was translated from Hebrew in the time of Solomon and Sheba, which would make the prophetic books obviously prophetic in a whole other sense, since if they hadn't yet been written in any language. Was a great deal of debate between people talking about the Greek, the Syriac, and in some of the cases, Aramaic. As Steve indicated, the Greek is viewed today as the most important of these translation texts, and it's generally acknowledged that Syriac influences on Ethiopian literature were largely late and almost entirely mediated through Arabic. What's quite remarkable to us looking at this debate is that because of the allure of antiquity, the scholars of the 60s and the 70s had no problem drawing conclusions about the quote-unquote original text, which was presumably translated in late antiquity on the basis of manuscripts dating from 800 or 1,000 years later, as if somehow they could look at a 14th century manuscript and say, well, this is what was going on in the 6th century. Indeed, this is a major theme of much of the Ethiopian scholarship, in which text structures and forms from the Middle Ages were assumed to have been passed down unchanged for hundreds, if not 1,000 years. Anyone who's familiar with some of the recent scholarship about the 9 saints or Saint Yared or the circular construction of Ethiopian churches will be familiar with this, that there's a great deal of literature which assumes all of this dates to late antiquity, and only now are people beginning to talk about how much later it is. Steve mentioned Michael Nib, who passed away about 10 months ago, and whose great contribution to Old Testament work was in his study of the book of Ezekiel. The book of Ezekiel is interesting in a number of ways. In some versions, as I'll say a word in a minute, it departs from either the Hebrew or the Greek text. There's also another element which isn't of relevance to us today, that the Andemta commentary on Ezekiel is also a totally unique document. The Ethiopian tradition says that the original version was lost and it had to be reconstructed, and it happened to be reconstructed by a monk who had spent time in Jerusalem. And so it's the one version of the Andemta in which we can cite direct influences of later Christian and rabbinic commentaries on the book. But Nib in his work is very aware that he's dealing with manuscripts which date from 1,000 years after the translation. Now, he divides his manuscripts into 2 main groups on the basis of age, and also to the extent to which they reflect or don't reflect some sort of knowledge, direct or indirect, of the Hebrew text. He also goes further and dividing these into different families, which I won't deal with here. But he's very concerned about the fact that chapters 42 to 48 of the book of Ezekiel and Gez show tremendous amount of variety based on whether they follow or don't follow Greek and Hebrew. As Steve mentioned, or maybe it was Garry who mentioned, although he's doing extensive work, he's working on the basis of 18 manuscripts, and to distinguish it from what we heard about today, his work is largely what I would call impressionistic. It's not a data-driven work. He does, however, note, and this is interesting, that different versions of Ezekiel must have been circulating at the same time within the Ethiopian church. And so that if you had a copy of this book from one manuscript, it was not necessarily what you found in another manuscript. And obviously this data project will help us nail down a great deal of this. So that sort of gives us a sense of where some of the study of the Bible or Old Testament text was, let us say, 25 years ago, certainly at the eve of this project. Let me make one or two other notes. When scholars first began to do quantitative work on a variety of topics, and I'm familiar a little bit with biblical text, hagiographies, conversion, they tended to forefront the conclusions and put the computer work into the background. So the people who did a computer analysis of the book of Isaiah were more interested in arguing that their analysis revealed two different authors for the book of Isaiah than they were in showing the nuts and bolts of how they constructed this sort of analysis. The people interested in looking at characteristics of sainthood in different periods were more interested in showing how sainthood had changed than they were in letting you understand what the criteria or data was that they were using, and patterns of Islam in Iran in different period. It was more about how these patterns fit a historical narrative than it was about making the data available to other scholars. One of the really interesting features of this project is the fact that we have an open access to data without integrally connecting the data to a particular interpretation, and so that scholars are being invited to use the data to ask new questions rather than to take this all as a package that here's what we did and here's what we found. Thank you very much. Drop the mic. One final note that I'd like to say, which leads to a broader issue, and it has to do with the 17th century. Last year, when we heard about the land grants and the transition from oral grants of land to many more written grants, the 7th century came up as a crucial period. And it was commented that the 7th century appears to be when the Andemta commentary went from being oral to being written, when musical transition to a large extent went from being oral to being written, when the grammatical tradition of Gez was codified in a written document, and when the script became much more uniform. So if I can move away from 1.5 million data points to a broad generalization, which still needs to be examined, it seems to me we're getting another piece of data, if I can misuse that term, that indicates that something very, very important in Ethiopian church history is happening in the 17th century, and this project is going to help us begin to nail that down even further. Again, thank you very, very much to the team of the project for all of their hours and hours of hard work and for this presentation. And I look forward to hearing more.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Steve, for that input and that background that leads up to a generation ago. I've brought forward Todd Hannaken here. I'm going to unpin Steve Kaplan. And Todd, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve. I don't know if we got a proper round of applause. It's hard to do that in Zoom, but very much congratulations to the whole team for all your work and the accomplishments that that you brought to us today. Um, I have some comments that are very different from Dr. Kaplan's. I'm not exactly a young man, but where I'm coming from is more the digital humanities perspective. And I don't have much to argue about Ethiopian history, although I do read and my dissertation was on the Book of Jubilees. So my comments are in three categories. One is more focused on the medium, the website and its affordances. And then second on the scholarly content and some of the decisions that were made. And finally, I was invited to think about some ideas for directions and future things to think about. Before I get into that, though, I just want to say that maybe my favorite thing about the whole project is the motto. The motto is we turn text into numbers, identify patterns in the numbers, and we turn numbers into stories. There's a lot of haggling about the term digital humanities and the field of digital humanities, and I think this does a pretty good job of getting at it. And I think the best of digital humanities, does tell a story, and it is very much a humanities project. And um, people often say that the digital humanities are necessarily collaborative, and I think that this project exemplifies that. When they say we, they mean we. And there was one video in which they talked about, well, all the videos were multi-speaker. One in particular, they talked about how working together kind of brought out new directions of how one piece could lead to the next piece. And you very much get a sense that this was a group exploration project, not a one person's agenda being implemented through technical labor. So my first area is the medium of the website, and the website is substantially videos. I think that that's interesting. I know my students prefer that medium, that being able to watch a video is somehow something they can do in a way that they can't do reading. Um, and especially if it were set up as a playlist where one video could play right after the other, one could get through it quite a bit. Um, I also want to set a calendar reminder to call Steve in 5 years and say, are you glad you did all that in the video medium? Because he's already saying that data is stale if it's 4 months old. I made some videos for my website, and they're hard to update. You can go back and fix a typo in text, but if you're really going to redo the whole set of videos every 4 months, 6 months, 12 months, 12 years. I think that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I'm still a fan of text because I think that being searchable and skimmable is an advantage. I worry about our kind of too long didn't read culture if some of the important pieces are buried in a video that no one watches. So we just heard a few minutes ago that they explained the difference between a dendrogram and a Lachmanian genealogy. I think it's a pretty important distinction. And if you're not paying attention to the videos, you could miss that. Um, and just on a very practical note, if you find yourself struggling to follow the videos, you have to manually set the resolution to high definition because Google will want to show it to you at 360 pixels lines high, which is really not enough to see what's being demonstrated in the videos. Um, Moving on to the scholarly content, I don't have a lot of criticism here. I admired the humility of pointing out when there were limitations in certainty and acknowledgement of some criticisms. I'm on board with the idea of a high altitude survey that doesn't require attention to prefixes and suffixes. I think focusing on root is very justifiable. I just had a few questions here. Would a plus of 5 consecutive words count the same as 5 separate variations of one word? And what would happen if you did it both ways? In many cases, um, a long plus is more significant than a short plus, but in other ways, a greater number of pluses could be significant as well. I don't know if they've already looked into that, but that was one question I had. Also displacement, if the same phrase is, shifted down a line, that could be, a haplography that was soon corrected or something like that. I would count that as a different variation than a meaning changing additional word. I was also questioned the concept of the pseudo cluster. Why not just have unaligned or miscellaneous? I think it's misleading to call something a cluster and then explain that it's actually a pseudo cluster. I would recommend, reevaluating that. Yeah, so I think those are all small, thoughts. I think if we're, thinking big for the future, and I'm reluctant to, walk up to someone who just finished a marathon and say, "Hey, have you heard about this ultra marathon?" I don't want the suggestions for more work to eclipse the congratulations on the work already done. But since I was invited, I'll offer what I have, and I think about extensibility. What could be done in the future to connect to other things, to make it easier to import things. My experience has been that at the end of a long project, I can look back and say, knowing what I know now, and knowing how I got here, and knowing what were the dead ends and what were the fruitful avenues, knowing what I know now, it could be made a lot simpler. And if that is the case, I think it would be great if the engine were kind of rebuilt in a way that someone could upload a maybe TEI file or a digital text of representing a manuscript, and align into columns automatically rather than manually. And my hunch is that if we tried to manually add a manuscript and that manuscript had another word, then we would have to shift all the columns over and other things like that would, become uninviting. But if the matching, if the identification of lemma could be automated, if the alignment of lemma could be automated, then I think it would be, really conceivable to really up the end numbers or to add books. As a scholar of Jubilees in First Enoch, I would have loved to have seen some of the studies on there. I noticed that that there is a coming soon for some downloadable software, but uploadable software, or what sites to which you can upload data is maybe even more attractive. Transcribus was mentioned. I think that I'd really like to learn more about that. One thing that there's some of that I'd like to see more of, I noticed that that you could access Dillman's lexicon, which is made available by I think in Hamburg, the Beta Machasef project. I wonder what more could be done to take advantage of what they're doing. I know they're not focusing on biblical material necessarily, but some of their other APIs are pretty exemplary by digital humanities standards, and that would be something that I would be interested in looking into. So yeah, I mean, I think I hope the suggestions didn't outweigh the praise. I think it's an exemplary project for digital humanities and an exemplary project for Ethiopian studies, and I look forward to continuing to use the project.
Thank you very much, Todd. I've written down several of those things. The extensibility thing, yeah, there's no end to where this stuff could go. And this is, I'll just respond to this one thing. How easy is that to do? The limits of our knowledge and understanding of technological possibilities, as humanities scholars, we say, wasn't trained for this, didn't learn any of that stuff, didn't know these concepts. What I learned, I had to find, or we had to find on our own, kind of a thing. Boy, if we could have built if we'd had available from the outset a system that could update once everywhere throughout the system, oh my goodness, that would have saved us hundreds of hours, maybe thousands of hours across these 12 years, but didn't know it, still don't know it. So the notion, you described it exactly well. To add one more manuscript to that end requires a whole set of operations. We've done it a couple times. We decided we had too small of a representation from the 20th century, and we had to bring 5 manuscripts into the thing. That meant rerunning the whole thing. And so after a while, you just make these time management decisions about what's possible in the scope of the project and mission creep and all that kind of stuff. But thank you. That really emphasizes the future of this kind of work and things that are important for it. Todd, I'm going to set you into the background here and we'll just open it up for just a couple minutes to other people who may, as a matter of fact, maybe we'll remove the pins from everyone and we'll just all be on the same. I can't. Oh, yeah, there we go. We've already exceeded, we're an hour and 20 minutes now into the thing. Wendy was not able to join us apparently, but if there are any other questions, comments, observations, we'd welcome them at this time for just a few more minutes. And anybody who has to leave, feel free to do so.
And I might suggest that we could go on a few minutes more if people have the time and the opportunity to do so. Otherwise, raise hand or just speak. Marcia.
Hi, thank you. I'm just blown away by what you've presented. I'm an art historian, and so my question is about what does this say about does decoration, is it as I don't mean uniform, but is it as consistent over the tradition? In other words, can you extrapolate from the treatment of, the way the scribes operate to the way artists might approach the manuscript? Are they working as consistently to protect the tradition and to, enshrine their work within it? Or is decoration or illustration something completely other and different than the work of the scribe, and adding variability and, varietas in the Latin, the sense of an aesthetic of difference. So I'm wondering if there's something that art historians like me might take methodologically from what you've shown about scribal practices.
Wow, this is a wonderful set of questions. Marcia, I'm going to assume that you are familiar with Wendy Belcher's PEM project, right? And for art historians, this is going to be, a major resource. But your question is really interesting. I bring it down to social location of the genre, right? Miracles of Mary manuscripts and stories are on the walls of churches and in the hands. There are huge numbers of manuscripts, far more manuscripts of the Miracles of Mary than we found. And that's because the social location of the Miracles of Mary is out in churches, whereas the biblical texts are in monasteries and not generally in churches. for the most part. That's broad. So I'd be curious. There may be other people present here that can speak. Michael, you are an art historian as well. You might have some ideas about this. There are some. I think this issue of the social location of where the manuscripts are used and who they're made for. You get some minimal things like the representation of the four gospel writers. That's a trope. That's just one of the things a book of the four gospels is supposed to have. I don't know of anything like that except the book of Psalms, which will often have a picture of David with his harp, at the front. But other than that, I know of no standard practices for including miniatures in books of the Ethiopic Old Testament. Michael, do you have anything to add to that?
Not for the biblical text, no. I'm just thinking of the mural paintings, for example. You're absolutely right. I mean, you have the south side of the Makdas, which is devoted to Mary. And it's an iconographical program which is largely copied from one church to the next. Not copied, but I mean there are enormous variations, but the biblical details are much less usual.
Rachel, I believe I saw that you were trying to raise your hand but weren't able to do that. Yeah, welcome, Rachel. Good to see you again.
Good to see you again as well. And I want to first of all congratulate you and Garry. I remember when you were starting out this project, and it's just an amazing contribution. And I'm here in Africa. I'm working with African universities and working on open access information. So it's very, very exciting to be able to get this tool to African scholars that are affiliated with us in West and Southern Africa. So thank you for this amazing work for the global quote unquote academy and this work. It's just amazing. I have a couple questions. The first question that I have is on the incredible lack of variation that you've been able to show with your large data sample. And I was wondering if you had also looked at the provenance of the scribes themselves, or were, as a member of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, I'm also curious as to whether or not it was possible to sort of figure out maybe from scribal hands or something, which Abinet Timurtibet they may have studied in. I'm very curious about the regions that the scribes came from, Gondar, Tigray, etc., and the Abinet Timurtibets that they may have visited, and whether or not that may have made an impact on the lack of discrepancy or idiosyncrasies in the manuscripts that you've looked at. So that's really a question about provenance and also where the scribes may have studied. And then I have another question, which is whether or not you've done comparative work on other corpora of biblical texts in terms of the level of variation. I'm curious, if we compare it to, for example, the Hebrew Bible or another corpus, what the variation is comparatively. And then my final question. My final question, very quickly. I was thinking about what Professor Kaplan was saying about earlier scholars finding, large amounts of variation, particularly this scholar who's only working with 18 manuscripts. And he did talk about sort of impressionistic deduction that's going on, or deduction to fit historical models, which I really compliment him on saying. Professor Kaplan, that was wonderful of you to bring out that point of the focus on historical models, fitting into historical models rather than being database, the way Professor Delamarter and Professor Jost heroically been. So my question is, when we're looking at, he talked about the adimta of the 17th century, perhaps impacting the lack of variation, but you with your collection are starting with 14th to 17th century also, if I'm correct.
That's
You
all
have
that's
sort of
available in any quantities, yeah.
right. So you're looking at pre-adimta manuscripts and finding with a huge body, an impressive body, an impressive body of, 400 odd manuscripts, that from the 14th to the 17th century, there was very little variation, which seems to show that prior to the 17th century, adimta, you already had this lack of discrepancy between texts. And in my thinking, what's interesting, and I see Peter Brown is here. I think that may be the Peter Brown who defined the term late antiquity. What's interesting in relation to what you have shown with the pre-17th century adimta, if we use that as a sort of marker, is what can we induce when we think about it in the context of Alessandro Bausi's controversial redating of the Ethiopian Bible to late antiquity, and the position that it was translated out of Greek, right? And so, what can we infer from this 14th to 17th century lack of variation about what may have happened from late antiquity until the 14th century? And can we say anything
Right.
about that? So,
Rachel, you've brought out 3 great big pots of delicious food and set them on the table, and we could be feasting here for some hours ahead. I'm sure we won't be able to get into all these. But just say, first of all, about the statistical assumptions. We make no claims, or we hope we have made no claims beyond evidence that we can show for it. So we have not done comparable work on other traditions. And it's very difficult actually to find statements about the uniformity of other traditions and know exactly what they mean by that. We know exactly what we mean by that because it's all granular in its detail, aligned columns, and how many times you have a column where only one manuscript is doing. I mean, there's no question then other than a transcribing error or alignment error in our work. So it's very hard to know. I find it impressive that 85% of the tradition is uniform throughout, but the dancing that goes on then even in the earliest attested period with the 2 main text forms that are EA1 and EA2 that are predictably different from one another and consistently different, slightly 1 or 2% different. Compared to the difference between the earliest attested text form, if you put that, the supercluster, compared to the earliest attested, compared to the supercluster of the standardized and modern Textus Receptus. And that's more like oftentimes up to 7, 8, 10% difference. So there's really something redactionally quite different and amazing going on through the 16th century. I often say people will ask the question, well, what caused that? And I say playfully, I have no idea, nor is it my responsibility. What we have done is create a set of statistical things that point like blazing signs to something and say, something is going on here. And then we bring that forward and we invite then the historians and the sociologists and others to come and try to figure out ways to explain the data. We're limited ourselves. We're a team that just has an interesting set of diverse things, but we don't have a great depth of all kinds of everything. So we've just done this one thing, tried to do it well, and we'll hope that it serves as that invitation to other folks to say, there's something here that needs explanation, and this documents that something. But what it is, we invite other people to get involved. Let me see. You put them out there so fast that what was the third point? That was about the uniformity of provenance. Provenance, you just have to come up with some conventions. So the only ones we had were, where were the manuscripts either microfilmed or digitized? Or, I mean, it's beyond all hope to think that you're going to get colophons that specify where these things happen. That's just not part of Ethiopic colophons in the main. So you're left with where the thing was digitized, and I think we can make some working assumptions. This is all they are, is working assumptions that manuscripts, maybe most manuscripts, didn't travel beyond 50 miles from the place where they were. Oh man, we could have a debate the whole day about whether or not that's the most reasonable convention to adopt as a way of thinking. That's when I were to extrapolate, the first thing you just have to do is bemoan the fact that we can't do that kind of work. That is, if we're expecting to have clear answers that nail things down. In our data sets, you'll notice that probably 2/3 of the manuscripts are in Ethiopia for every one of the books we study. 1/3 come from someplace else. And all those someplace else's, including every place in Europe and every place in North America, those manuscripts become useless almost for provenance questions. Just have no idea that metadata wasn't kept. And so we don't even know how they got there and where they were from. Sometimes we can deduce some things, but so it's like there's so many problems. It's much more difficult to do geographic dispersion models than it is to do chronological models, because you can always date on paleography. And then if you get lucky, and you do get lucky quite often, to have an historical figure that we know a date for, so you can run chronological. And I think this 14th to 16th century, 17th to 20th century thing is just clear as a bell. Now you can quibble a little bit. Curt likes to say the standardized began in the late 16th century. That's primarily because of 2 or 3 manuscripts that seem to anticipate readings, and yet none of those fall perfectly into the standardized. So I tend to say in the 17th century, the standardized text took its place as the dominant text form being produced. But those are small quibbles, and you can get down to a 50-year debate based on chronological information. Geographic stuff, I tried to do this with the Miracles Mary project, where we had an N of 94 manuscripts, okay, 3 times our normal thing. And I put a working theory of 3 regions in the country: the northern region, the western, so northern Tigray, and then the western region of Gojam and Gondar, and then the southern region of Shoa, and so on. And again, you can't posit that as fact. You posit that as a working hypothesis, and then you say, if that working hypothesis, does the data actually fit into those things? Are there some traceable sorts of things that show up in text? And with that Miracles of Mary, I realize that data isn't posted yet, but there's very clear evidence that the Cannibal of Kemer story went through recensions that are geographically based, and we can name where those things came from. But the challenges, methodological challenges around. I'd love to see a love for Michael or Wendy or Aaron now at Hamburg to convene a meeting of text historians and text critics and statisticians to talk about what kinds of ends are necessary to make what degrees of certainty claims about things. You're using all this data, but do you know how to do a test for the degree of the reliability? What size of an N is necessary to make claims that have a 95% certainty kind of thing? See, we humanities folks don't know that language, don't know those categories, and how to carry out that kind of conversation. So I'd love to see somebody convene a convention of folks where we can get together and talk about those sorts of things. So many more things could be talked about there, but we'll maybe leave it there. Yeah, you're still here. I commend you.
Everybody is so interested, Steve. I think that's the reason. Do we have another pressing question and to end up the conversation with? Well, perhaps I could ask Steve whether any work like this has been done on the Old Testament for anywhere around the Mediterranean world. In other words, is what you've done for Ethiopia absolutely unique, or do we have a group of scholars who are doing a similar kind of study for on the more European Byzantine side?
Certainly, the Hebrew Bible and the Septuagint have huge projects of which they've done computer databases of things that the question there is finding comparable data sets that were designed to answer the same questions. So it'd take a little while to we haven't made that a focus of our work. It'd be a wonderful thing to get people who are deeply involved with those to be able to say, okay, you've done this, we've done something similar, but here's what the differences are, and here's how that would matter when it comes to trying to create comparisons. Marcia, did you have a point to add to that, or I saw a hand go up there a little bit ago. Okay.
Can you answer my third question if there's no other questions from anyone else?
Remind me what the third question was?
Yeah, my third question was, given that you're looking at pre-Adimta texts, if we look at Professor Kaplan's commentary that the Adimta may have led to less variation, you're looking at pre-Adimta, would you dare to make any kind of inferences about, whether or not that may be an indication as to whether or not from the late antiquity, when Professor Bausi says the Ethiopian Bible, the Abuna Gerima Gospels were translated from Greek into Ge'ez, do you think that there might be what do you think the probability is that lack of variation could reach back that far?
Yeah. I have to say, Rachel, it's a wonderful question. I acknowledge it or recognize it as such, but I don't have enough knowledge of Endemta material and the historical setting and so on to give any kind of an informed response. I apologize for that. Well, I think Michael will turn back over to you and we can close.
Absolutely. Well, Steve, we're all extremely grateful for this extraordinary undertaking that you and the group have achieved, and it gives us an example to strive for. In a long-term objective down the road, and of course, as you and I have spoken often enough, there's always more. As soon as you turn the next page, there's more to be done. But this is a tremendous contribution to the study of the Old Testament in Ethiopia. So thank you very much, and also Garry, I think he's gone, and Todd also gone. And Steve Kaplan, thank you so much for your contributions. That was extremely interesting, valuable, and sets the stage for further discussion. So I think we can sign off.